Yeah, I think you have to do it.
All right, so it's done.
Okay.
So a very warm welcome, everyone. I think this is the second webinar of its series. In the first instance, we had it according to the Middle East time zone. And now we are doing it according to the European time zone. And eventually we will move to the rest of the part of this world. So I think in the follow-up, our next webinar is going to be on the 11th of December, which would be according to the Singapore time frame, focusing on the Southeast Asia. And we have a significant registrations for today, and I'm hoping more people are going to join with the passage of time. So in this webinar, which is being presented by the International Center for Enterprise Engagement, and this is regarding the ISO 30414, which is the human capital reporting standard for internal and external stakeholders. So Lee, would you like to move the slides ahead? Okay, thank you. So in this webinar, we are going to discuss the overall standards which have been developed by the ISO TC 260. And those of you who are familiar with the ISO Technical Committee 260 know that this committee has a mandate of developing the HR standards. And in this webinar, we are going to focus particularly on the ISO 30414, which is the human capital reporting standard, and how does it benefit the organizations. What is the current human capital regulatory and the disclosure climate, in which direction it is heading? What assistance do organizations need in human capital disclosure for internal and external purposes? What are the overall ISO standards, and how do they help the management in general and the human capital management in particular? How professionals can benefit from the ISO 30414? And what is the process of getting certified on this standard? So Lee, next slide, please. Okay, one slide ahead. All right. So a word about the ISO ICE, which is International Center for Enterprise Engagement. So this has been founded in 2018 by the people who led the creation of the ISO Human Capital Standards Working Group and helped oversee the development of nearly all the human capital standards. Based near New York City, with a European office near Lille, France, and an affiliate in Islamabad, we intend expanding the outreach of and having more partners around the globe. And our goal is to help organizations benefit from the same strategic and the systematic approach to human capital management that the ISO has achieved for quality management through ISO 9001 standards and certifications. Next, please. So we are fortunate to have a team of a very dynamic team being led by the Bruce Bolger, who is the managing director. Based near New York City, Bruce is responsible for the overall operation, the brand promise fulfillment. We also have the Anne-Sophie Prouvost, who is Global Engagement Director, based near Lille, France. And Sophie is in charge of the customer engagement and support, brand management, content marketing, social media, and the events. Now, before I request Lee to take over and educate us about the ISO 30414, few words about the Zoom, particularly for those who are using it for the first time. As you know that this is a very convenient platform with the audio video facility. So we are not using the video, and we would request everyone to keep the audio in the mute form. You have the chat box in front of you. So while the Lee Webster is presenting, if you have any question or a comment, please do type over there, and we would like to take the questions in the order they appear. If during the course of webinar, if your connection gets dropped, there's nothing to worry. You can use the same link to reconnect. In case it gets held or there's some other technical glitch, just refresh your browser and it would resume. Now, without taking any further time, I would like to hand over the presenter rights to Lee Webster. And Lee, over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Zahid, I'm going to ask a question. That is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
Very well.
All right. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening to all the attendees at this webinar. My name is Lee Webster, and I'm happy to participate in this discussion, or at least this opportunity to reveal what we're trying to do in developing a certification solution for ISO 30414, which is reportable human capital. The first slide you see, a little bit about me and why I'm here is, as Zahid mentioned, ISO TC 260 for human resource management. I founded that technical committee in ISO, served as its first chair, and for several years as its secretary. And I was blessed to learn from and work with experts across the globe in various projects dealing with human resource management. And so I have a kind of an overview sense of 30414. I've also read the standard and have a deep understanding of the elements of it. But my job here is to just give a sense of what's going on here. And I'll try to make it as global as possible as I describe it. But a lot of the context I can bring to it is from, well, what's going on in the US and how is the US responding to this document? So you're going to get a lot more of that in this discussion. And I think it'll give you, I hope it'll give you enough to make decisions. So as you see here on the screen, we have the ISO human capital standards. Again, there's other technical documents and in fact, a couple of other standards that fall under ISO TC 260. And I refer you to the ISO website if you'd like to explore this subject more about the standards. But the ones that you see on the screen right now are ones that are of particular interest to ICE, that certifications are being developed in. Obviously 30414, then ISO 10018, which actually came out of TC 176 in quality, dealing with quality people management. And then the last three are standards that were developed in TC 260, which is 30401, which is about knowledge management. How do you create, how do you maintain knowledge? How do you transfer it within an organization so that it doesn't leak out? ISO 10667, which actually initially came from another project committee, deals with assessment services. How do you assess human beings? What's the right way to do that? And then finally, ISO 30409, which is workforce management, and how do you actually develop workforce management tools and solutions that are consistent across the globe. Some of the key benefits for the human capital standards. So we're going to focus now on 30414. And what we want to lead off with is what are the benefits of actually having standards in this space? And as a 30-year professional in human resource management, one of the challenges I've always had to deal with is when I'm trying to compare metrics within an organization that I work in, or even against competitors or the sector that I'm in, I'm comparing often apples to oranges. I don't know what's in their metrics or in the numbers they've created, and it limits the credibility that I have with leadership. So a strategic, systematic, and proactive approach to managing always yields better results that are tactical, rather than tactical and reactive results. And that's what we're trying to achieve. Rather than human resources data being things we deal with after the fact, we actually can use the data to make better decisions. And what's measured is also, as we all know, likely what's going to be focused on. And if it's measured well, we get the right amount of focus, including resources. Standards demonstrate an organization is focused on the process and not just on the results. And although outcomes are very important, maintaining an effective, I'd even say humane process that is actually reflects what's going on in the workplace is critical in order to make an effective organization. Human capital standards respond to the demands of investors. And I guess that's one of the strongest pools here. Whether it's internal stakeholders or external stakeholders like investors in private equity organizations, there's an increasing demand, and I think you're going to see this in this presentation, for that type of information for these people to make decisions about whether to invest in one company versus another. And their concern, which is legitimate, is that the data, as I've indicated earlier, is so variable, so inconsistent in how it's calculated and what goes into it. They're not sure if they can make an educated decision about what to invest in, but they want to invest based upon that additional aspect of information. And then Finally, and there's probably more benefits than what we can think of here, but the last one we mentioned is the standards provide a roadmap to sensible practices and metrics that, and the goal of creating standards, and one of the reasons why I started this effort was a need. My background is also in engineering, a need to establish a framework of effective practice in human resource management, so that no matter what company I went to or where in the world I would go, I would know that I could expect at least this level of performance, or expect metrics to be, or measurements to be conducted this type of way, no matter what country I went to or what organization I went to work for, obviously of those who adopt. Very quickly, the historical context is again focused on what I know about metrics, and that is, if you recall, there was a gentleman named Frank Galbraith who in the earlier part of last century actually started the time and motion studies. And those of us who've looked at our textbooks on human resource management know that that was one of the first efforts to actually understand how people work and can you measure it. And then Frederick Winslow Taylor, they were contemporaries, also began to look at it from using scientific principles in order to determine if we can create measures that are reliable, measures that you can make business decisions on. And that's where actually the concept of scientific management came from. Dr. Jack Fitzenz, and some of you may recall who he is or know this gentleman, he actually is aware of the work that we're doing and is very supportive of it. Was a pioneer in the 70s about measurement. He has very many books about how to measure organizations' human capital properly, back when it was considered personnel, and then became human resources. And so he popularized this concept. And then now, I think what we would find if we looked across the globe is a lot of organizations actually capture this human capital data, but they capture it their own way. And some report it, but many do not. And so we're trying to figure out, can we more consistently calculate this data? And is there an appetite to reporting what we've calculated within our organizations for investors and other stakeholders? So to give you a sense of the timeline now in the more modern period, and in 2009, XBRL Inc., which is an organization that was creating a kind of a software language for financial reporting, approached the Society for Human Resource Management to develop an American National Standard of Reportable Human Capital. At the time, I was the director of standards, HR standards development for SHRM. And so we established a task force, and it was a domestic US task force of experts from various fields, accounting, investing, and human resources, to explore this, because one of the things we also recognize is this couldn't be just created by just HR people. It had to also include those who had an interest and expertise in finance and in what investors would want to know from this information. In 2011, ISO created a technical committee. We mentioned it before, TC 260. And in 2012, though, as we began to develop the standard, there was frankly strong objection in the US to creating this standard in human capital. And there are many reasons, but one of the principal reasons is that it was so unfamiliar to the human resources community that they weren't sure what it would mean to them and how it would affect them. And they preferred that there weren't uniform standards, at least in the US in this area. So SHRM decided it would no longer pursue development of these standards out of the American National Standards Program. But Deutsche Bank contacted me personally and said, this is too important to just let it go away. They were actually observing what was going on in the US. And so they decided to sponsor the development of an international standard in reportable human capital, because they also said there's a much higher degree of interest and a higher appetite for this type of information globally than perhaps there is in the US. And we want to make sure that that prospers. So the standard was started, and in 2018, the standard was completed and published. So that's the history. Now we're going to get into just a little more philosophy about who might be interested, who are those stakeholders that we're trying to appeal to when we're developing this human capital certification. What you see on the screen, and it may be difficult to see, and we can make these slides available to you, but what we tried to accomplish is to identify with some measure of specificity all of the stakeholders that we think would have a interest in being certified, or that certification is done properly and well. So starting at the top, we have investors and boards of directors, regulators, management. That means senior management in an organization, including the human resources leadership, talent analytics professionals. Those are often people that are left out of the discussion, but they're the ones who actually gather the data together and make it available for management, and they analyze it and help management determine what does this turnover mean. I also learned recently that reporting in most organizations is separate from data analytics, and therefore reporting is a different activity, and they have a different interest in certification than perhaps the talent analytics people do. Then security attorneys or lawyers, consulting firms that either train or actually certify people, the HRIS systems like the PeopleSoft, like the Oracles, like the Workdays, and others across the globe, they would have to readjust their algorithms in their software to accommodate these new calculations if they're adopted widely, and therefore they would have an interest. Academics and researchers, people in finance, and finally workers and workers advocates, whether it's unions, work councils, or just the individual workers themselves. All of these people, all of these groups, I should say, have a interest in how this moves forward. And if you were looking at the slide, you'll notice that certain ones have a red circle around them. And the reason why I placed that there is I believe in particular those groups would be interested in being certified because they would have a more direct interest in making sure that these things are done well. This is just my opinion, but this is why this chart exists. And again, it's trying to get us to understand what is the universe of interests here. And if you see other groups that should be represented, or you think that there's a group here that should be removed, I'm open to a discussion about that at some point in the future. So what are the human capital reporting standards and how they benefit organizations? So what I put on the screen is not the actual standard. It is the pre-publication version of the standard. If you would like the actual standard, I encourage you to go onto ISO website and purchase it, or to your local national standards bodies websites and purchase it. But it's 98, 99% what is in this document. And what you see in the document is this chart. And the chart attempts to describe what is the core. If you look at the center, the human capital reporting, what are those reporting areas that the members of the working group and the technical committee ultimately decided are those categories of measures that would be important to the investors or to internal reporting needs. And they also tried to describe or determine what are some of the external stakeholders. So it's their version of my earlier slide. Who's interested in getting this kind of information internally, and who's interested in getting this kind of information externally. And what you see is that there's different levels of reporting of these measures, but one is a micro level, which is more internal. One is more meso, which is what type of information is of more interest to the company or the industry, like SMEs and NGOs, and then finally macro. And we're talking economics level, of state level, country level interest, or even global interest. In what context do you describe these metrics, and how would you relate them to those more state level or higher interests? So that's the framework. As we get closer to it, some of the key understandings is all human capital includes the cumulative knowledge, skills, and abilities of an organization's people and the impact on an organization's long-term performance. And that was intentional. This is out of the introduction of ISO 30414. So we're not looking at this from a quarter by quarter perspective. The standard is trying to get people to think about the long-term opportunities of being able to understand and communicate the performance of the people and its impact in an organization. And some of the definitions are incorporated in 30414, but there's also definitions in the another standard document, which is 30400, which is the vocabulary. There's actually a vocabulary of human resource management that we hope, as it is adopted across the globe, people begin to speak with using the same terms and understand those terms the same way. Specific benefits to organizations, as we see it, is it stabilizes human capital reporting. I've worked in organizations where you had 4 or 5 different ways to, or actually 3 or 4 different ways to communicate full-time equivalency or turnover. And that made it very difficult within the organization to make decisions about, are things going well or not in our workforce. It allows us to align what we're doing with the organizational leaders. And when I say we, I mean the human resource function, with what the intent and the goals of the organizational leadership are, as a member of that leadership, but also as an organization providing information and services to it. Talent analytics and reporting needs to be more professional in what it does, akin to what's going on in financial analysis and reporting. And so this will allow that to happen. I've mentioned this earlier, but apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparison of data is crucial for people to make decisions. They need to know that they're comparing the same type of information. And so this will allow that to happen. Rewards those organizations, therefore, that manage their workforces effectively. If I'm hotel chain A and I have really good data and it's comparable to hotel chain B that has not so good workforce performance data, that might be a very important determinant for me on whether I'm going to invest in A versus B, particularly in a very highly labor-oriented service sector. And this allows those types of decisions to occur. And then finally, it provides metadata. And what I mean by that is, as we talked about earlier, those national bodies or international bodies that do research and collect data and report data back to their countries, just like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this provides a level of data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States might want to use when it reports data to the country about how things are going in the workplaces. So we're moving now to what is the current human capital regulatory disclosure climate. So this is focused more in the US, as I mentioned earlier when I started this discussion. The US Securities Act, but it gives you kind of an idea of the tempo and the movement that's going on in the United States in this regard. And if you compare that to what I mentioned earlier, where we were more or less told to stop work on a domestic program, we're now seeing a dramatic shift in the United States where the securities regulators think this should happen. So quick history, 1933, when the Securities Act was created, what it required is that people who issue stock, we call them registers in the United States, disclose or make clear or communicate to investors information so that those investors can make informed decisions. And this information has to be material. In our domestic US context, that means it has to be germane, it has to be specific and important to making good decisions with respect to that stock. It's information that an investor needs to know to make that decision. And so there was a Supreme Court case in the 1930s that defined what's material, and material is information that is essential for a reasonable investor to make prudent investment decisions. But what's interesting in the United States is when the securities law was created, they only had one entry in the law about what is required to be disclosed with respect to human capital, or back then personnel information. And if you go all the way to the bottom of this bullet point, it says the only information in the United States currently that issuers of stock are required to provide to investors about the workforce in a company is the number of people who work there. That's it. And sure, you'll find some companies provide a little bit more, but they can't provide any less than that. But the truth is that type of information isn't all that helpful. So the current chairman of the SEC, Chairman Clayton, has addressed various international organizations. In fact, he was in Ireland talking to his counterparts in Ireland about his belief that there should be more information made available to shareholders about how the human capital is managed in organizations. What you also see on the slide is that CFO Magazine did a really nice expose recently on human capital's big reveal and what kind of information should be disclosed about the workforce. And ISO 30414 is profiled in large degree in that article and compared to other efforts that are being done. So I would encourage you to get a copy of this article. If you don't have it, we can make this available to you as a PDF. I'm not going to go into detail in this next slide, but what you see, the SEC Human Capital Disclosure recent timeline is from July in 2017, a body called the Human Capital Coalition reached out to the SEC, Chairman Clayton's organization, and said, look, this is important. We want to hear a ruling from the SEC about whether human capital should be included in investor communications. And so the SEC did some research, and what you're seeing here is the back and forth that went for several months about whether that should happen. And the short of it is, if you go back down to the bottom where Chairman Clayton's remarks at the Financial Centers Summit in Dublin, Ireland, he made it very clear that he thinks this is important information. And so the only question is what type and how much. And what we're proposing and what we've communicated to the SEC is that ISO 30414 provides a really great framework to answer that question. If you're trying to figure out what you should report and how you should report it to meet those expectations that you're communicating, why not use this standard? It exists and it's ready for that type of work. If you click the links, they're active and they take you through the various discussions and comments of various organizations. And at the very bottom with October the 16th, it's actually a video of Chairman Clayton. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at it when you get a chance. And by the way, this is the guidelines proposal that the SEC most recently sent out, and that's available. It's one of the links so that you can see what they were thinking about what could be. Frankly, they were thinking in a range of maybe 5 to 10 metrics rather than the number that we have here. Sorry about that. And what we're trying to do is help people understand that these 10 metrics, whether it's 10 metrics or whether it's all the metrics that are described in the standard, will at least move the ball or make the communications to investors better than what the current state is now. And so the change that you'll find in those guidelines or those recommendations, they're not guidelines yet, that he sent out for comment, he was looking at worker recruitment, employment practices, employee benefits, and grievance mechanisms. I think the intent there was to try to find out how frequently do people complain in your organization formally. Maybe that's something investors would want to know. Employee engagement, what does that mean? Can we normalize what that means so we can see? Employee investment in employee training, health and safety, and other strategies and goals. So these are just ideas he had, and he was looking for some feedback, and he got quite a bit of feedback. And I think they're now deciding on what they're going to do now with that feedback in the United States. I also provided this slide. It just gives you a sense. It's out of that CFO magazine. Other groups, what they're doing, how they're involved in this discussion. And what you're seeing, for example, when you get a chance to read this, there's the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism called EPIC. It's a group that's formed, I think it's mostly out of Europe, but it has people in other countries engaged. And they're looking at this subject, not just exclusive to human capital, because they're also looking at sustainability and other issues, but human capital is one slice of it. And they're very interested in 30414 as a framework to moving the discussion forward about reporting human capital information. So we're really excited about that. If you go online, please take a look at EPIC, and you'll see a very substantial organization trying to solve a lot of problems across the globe, and seeing human capital management as one of them. This slide, very quickly, if you can see the world map, is I just want to give you a sense of the number of countries engaged that I am aware of in this work. Everything from the ICEE meetings that are occurring to a meeting that recently occurred in New York with a human capital reporting group there that is trying to talk to these talent analytics, professionals about how they can get more involved. We also had meetings in New York with the investor community. Investment organizations like BlackRock were involved in these discussions, and I don't want to speak for them, but they were intrigued about what's going on here. So we're really excited that the investment community doesn't see a risk, but perhaps even an opportunity in providing this information, as long as it's managed effectively. And you can see work being done in other countries and meetings that have occurred in other countries. And there is perhaps a lot more that's going on that I'm familiar with. In fact, undoubtedly. And that's what gets us excited too, because there's a lot more work going on and there's an interest in this subject. And I put the logos on the other side because I wanted to mention, because in the last meeting we were talking to professionals in Pakistan and that region of the world, that Islamic finance, the interest that they have in having good metrics actually correlates very nicely with what's in ISO 30414. So this is not limited to Western European or Western views of finance. You can find value in this in other views of finance as well. And that's also one of the beauties of this standard. What assistance do organizations need in human capital disclosures for internal and external? What I'm attempting to here is to use the subcontractor, supplier, and customer model to describe what's going on here. What you have is a group of people, I'm describing them as subcontractors in an organization. They're not actually contractors, but they're subgroups in organizations. They could be the analytics department, or they could be a third-party contracting organization. They gather data, they provide that data to the human resources or to organizational management, and then the human resources organization management, using the ISO standard, communicates this information to investors, boards of directors, and all the other interest groups that I mentioned on that other slide. When you're trying to determine if people are conforming to a standard, this is the typical structure that you find in countries. You can find slight variances, but essentially a contractor, which is a product or service, a product or service provider, which I talked about earlier, is the third party providing the data, provides information to a customer, but they also could provide it through a third party. That third party usually then works through a registrar or a person who certifies that third party. And that registrar, by the way, often in most countries is accredited by their own country or accredited by some third-party organization as being an appropriate and sufficient auditor of the work that company is doing. So in a nutshell, you have people who certify. They're usually overseen by someone who accredits them to certify. And they go to companies or organizations that want to be certified over a particular standard. And in this case, it's 30414. But in order to be certified, they have to follow the standard. So they get data from third parties, they get other information from people like customers, and that's how they formulate, based using the standard, the practice that they're being audited against that has to conform. And we're being very careful when we use language. It's conform with the standard. As I mentioned before, the typical national approach is a government has a national accreditation structure, and those three organizations or three blocks underneath, those are types of certifying bodies. So one is an inspection, sometimes they're laboratories, and sometimes they're certification bodies themselves, and they certify a company who provides products or services to a customer. And so, again, that's a typical approach. Depending upon the country you go to, they may not have government involved in any kind of direct way. And they may also describe in more detail who can be a certifying body. What are ISO standards and how do they help management in general? We've covered a lot of this. Again, we gave you a thumbnail view of the standards, but here's, right off the ISO website, are all of the standards and other types of technical documents that are available for people to use within their organizations. And what I've done in the next slide is I've tried to break it down in a way where you see the difference between an administrative standard, and again, this is my judgment. So the vocabulary standard is more administrative. It helps us understand what the common language would be. But these process standards, there are several standards that describe specifically processes and how they should be done to be in conformance with the ISO standard. And then measurement standards. And the measurement standards, and actually it should be more technical documents than standards. These are technical documents that deal with specific ways to measure things. There'll be more of these as time moves on. In fact, ISO TC 260 is working on developing the actual calculations and algorithms for all the metrics that were described in 30414. In 30414, by the way, when you get it, you'll see some things are described in great detail, but others are described in a detail where it leaves it open to your judgment on what to put in there. The decision's been made, though, that we're going to give people examples of what it means to describe a metric a particular way, with the goal at the end of the day that we're all using that same type of approach. So I expect that those measurement technical documents to be a much longer list by the end of this year. So in general, documented processes are what standards are. They're strategic tools that help businesses reduce costs, satisfy customers, and open access to new markets. They're consistent and transparent. And in fact, the entire process has been very transparent. There are documents that are available for you to read to see how we got from here to there. You can actually join the committees that work on these documents and participate in their improvement over time. ISO standards have to be revised at least once every 5 years. And so we expect within by 2023, this document will be reopened and there will be improvements made to it. And that might be a lovely opportunity for you to be a part of that work. And if you're interested in that, please let me know. There's a document that was, or an article that was written in the New York Times Magazine called The Joy of Standards. And it really talks about, in beautiful language, what the benefits of standards are in general to society. So there's a link here. If you want language to take to your leadership in your organizations or to your potential customers to say to them, this is why you want standards to exist in your marketplace. And this is why you want to conform to those standards. That article is a really great tool for you to use. And then we're back to 30414. It provides a common, credible, and comparable way to communicate the value of the workforce to investors and to internal stakeholders as well, to the entire community that has an interest in that type of information. So how can professionals benefit from it? And I'm not going to go through each of these because we've talked about them at one level or another. I'd like to focus on enhancing understanding of financial and non-financial returns. It will elevate, particularly for the human resources function, but I think for the organization as well, that there are also non-financial returns that are that create wealth for an organization. And it will elevate those returns in a way where they matter to those who would like to invest in those organizations. And that's particularly useful to folks who manage human capital, because people's competencies, the employees' skills that they've developed through training or through experience, to activities they participate in that create capability in them, those can often straddle both the concrete and non-concrete type of value an organization or an individual creates for an organization. And our goal is to try to get closer to understanding, does that create value? Does that indeed create value for an organization? And 30414 is that first step to understanding the full range of wealth, not only the hard goods create for the organization, but the humans create for the organization. And so that's why we're excited about it. It's the first real concrete step in that direction. So if you go to the 30414, one of the things you'll see is the document attempts to demonstrate or provide an example of what a report of human capital might look like. And again, this is a first draft of history. In time, maybe it'll be different, or maybe depending upon the sector, some metrics will be more prominent than others. But there is a way to report this information in a way that is compelling to investors. And that's one of the things certifiers will help companies do. Figure out how to now present this information in a way that has impact for their shareholders. And we talked about the multiple organizations and stakeholder relevance that we talked about. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So how's it done? Well, organizations that seek ISO 30414 certification will have to demonstrate that they have a strategic, ongoing, and measurable commitment to maximizing organizational results through developing and gathering these metrics. And then even solution providers, these are people who actually help provide solutions to companies needing to demonstrate the value that human capital creates to organizations. And also providing solutions for people who want to be certified as well. They need to demonstrate during on-premise face-to-face meetings their capability to provide those services. We're talking more along the lines of training. In most cases, organizations can demonstrate compliance through disclosure of written business plans, demonstration of ongoing practices. So those of you who are considering certification, these are the kinds of tools or information you'll be looking for. They'll also be looking for you'll be looking for metrics related to those plans and measurement systems applied. You're going to be looking for not just, do I have a metric or 10 metrics, but do I have a system to manage the flow of that information, and is that information attached to the goals of the business through its business plans or strategy? If all of that is there, then you have a truly functional reporting solution. Otherwise, you could just have people reporting data that has no relevance to what the business plans or goals are, which would confuse investors and frankly would not be material information. So it all has to be connected. And that's what certifiers are going to be looking for. Are those connections and alignments apparent? And depending upon the type of a certification, solution providers demonstrate face-to-face meetings, their ability to provide objective audit or certification, or as developers to offer comprehensive measurable result. So, these are some tips on how to use 30414, obtain management commitment. That is probably the most important thing. If the senior leadership or the department that's engaged is not committed to this, then there's just a risk that this will be just an activity that has no real impact on the performance of the organization. Document procedures, interview key participants, train people. Some of that's going to have to occur here. Implement those procedures, implement those decisions that are made. Are they implemented? Is there a record management system? Is there even an internal audit system to make sure that this data is correct and accurate? And then finally, and the processes are being followed. And then finally, communicate those results. How are we doing that? And is that being done in a way that's rigorous? So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that at the end of the day, ISO 30414 is here. The document's available across the globe. And as I've talked to business professionals, particularly in the analytics space, many of them already have it, and they're already trying to figure out how to incorporate it in how they operate. Investors are aware. We'd like them to be more aware of this. But those who are aware, one of the things they ask me personally is, we don't know what we need to know about human capital metrics. So will this help us learn what it is we should be looking at? And my thinking is yes, it is a document that helps you focus your attention to the things that are important, at least at this stage, as we progress in this effort. The regulatory bodies, at least in the United States, but I understand in other countries like Australia, and maybe in Germany as well, they have strong interest in this. I know US does. And the interest in this is accelerating. So businesses in the United States, at least, or organizations that want to do business in the United States that are part of the equity markets, are going to have to respond to this standard in some way. And then finally, it elevates not only human resources and the value it provides, but it also elevates and recognizes the value and the contributions that employees make in organizations. And depending upon the investor or organization we're talking about, that's unrecognized value that I think is going to be profound and will help organizations improve in a way that we haven't seen since this type of data has been captured. So with that, I think it's very important that we proceed in developing this body of certifiers, people who can do this work, that we get lots of feedback on how this is working, that we work at this in a way where we're trying to improve as we try ourselves, as well as we're trying to improve other organizations. I see this as a rich, open playing field for those who are interested in this subject. We're excited with the progress that has been made in the last several years, and we hope you are too. With that, I'm going to hand the platform back over to Zahid. And Zahid, do you have any questions in the chats?
Thank you, Lee Webster, for this comprehensive briefing. Now, I think the house is open for any questions. I would request you to use the chat box for typing your questions. And if there's a question, I would request also Bruce Bolger to join in giving the response, which is where he feels appropriate to respond. All right, so yes, is there any question or the comment? I think we have people from 6 different countries, including United States, Germany, Cyprus, Italy, Azerbaijan, and Pakistan. So if there are any questions, feel free to type in the chat box and we'll be happy to answer.
I have a question for the group. Are there any countries or any people representing certain countries that you think will resist this standard, will be uncomfortable, and why do you think this resistance will occur?
Okay, Marco, would you like to have any comment on the question that is being posed by the Lee Webster from the Italy point of view?
Let me unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yep. Okay. Well, the question, I do not have a lot of information on what is happening now in the Italian country, at least in the Italian market. I mean, I'm seeking information on this. I would like to understand actually if there is something happening at EU level. If someone in the chat is aware of, you know, if the EU commissions or any type of committees are thinking of doing something at EU level. Because if it becomes something, if it becomes a norm at EU level, probably, you know, that might drive down a lot of actions for the different entities, both in the various countries.
Well, I'll speak first. This is Lee. I'm not familiar with any work that's being done or any communication that has been done with the EU with respect to this. That's a really good question. And what I will commit to doing is finding out if they're aware and to the degree they are. And I'll also reach out to those folks at the EPIC organization I mentioned, because I imagine I have a connection with the EU, and to see if this information has gotten to them. So it's a really good question. Once I get an answer, we'll figure out a way to get a response to everyone on this call so that you know.
Yes, just maybe one thing, something to look for. I mean, my understanding is that at least in within, I would say, the big umbrella of sustainability, under social sustainability, which includes a lot of dimensions that are present in the ISO 30414. I mean, they are looking at, you know, at several, I would say, norms. Right. That should then be, I would say, decline in specific actions in the various, I would say, you know, obligations that corporations that are present in Europe should comply with. So I believe within that umbrella, something might come. But
well, that's actually a very good point. one of the things that we're hearing from where everybody has to find a way to bring it in. I mean, it has to fit the organization's approach to work and what it does. And what we're finding is that there's a very attractive connection between the human capital metrics work and organizations that want to be prominent in corporate social responsibility. So if I was a certifier going out and talking to companies, I would say to them, you're very prominent in trying to demonstrate sustainability is key to you. Your corporate social responsibility program is very advanced, or you want it to be advanced. Well, understanding human capital management, understanding the metrics and how they actually create wealth or value or performance for your organization actually supports your corporate social responsibility structure. So let's talk about how we can use that to start up a certification program in your organization. So there's a way to make a connection that is legitimate in most organizations. And so sustainability, corporate social responsibility, there's connections there to ISO 30414.
Thank you. Bruce, would you like to add something to the same question? Because you provided me something, some information which was quite relevant to it yesterday. Hello, Bruce, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I accidentally got disconnected.
Okay.
Did you hear his question, Bruce?
No, I did not. In fact, I'm lucky I got back on so fast. So
okay, what we were doing is we were talking about corporate social responsibility and the connection that human capital measures could have toward an organization achieving its goals. That might be a way to kind of communicate the value of doing certification. Do you have additional thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, coming in a little, I want to also address something that I heard the gentleman from Italy. I can answer a question about that too. Quickly, the European Union has now mandated that all of the countries come up with regulations related to disclosures by companies or organizations that employ more than 500 people, because companies of that scale are considered to be of so they have a social impact. So this is very relevant to these standards because obviously companies are going to need a way to certify that this information is actually true and comparable, as Lee pointed out earlier in the presentation. And also ISO standards create what's called, at least in US terminology, safe harbor. That is that if an organization has ISO standards, it shows that they're in conformity with international certification. So I think informing the European Union of ISO standards, since they're already well accepted in Europe, and the Germans have really been terrific. I have to say, the German HR community has embraced ISO human capital standards like no others. So my hat's off to them. And then to address the other question, we think the opportunity for ISO standards, particularly as they relate to ISO 30414, will be in corporate responsibility reports or sustainability reports. And you will notice that an increasing number of companies throughout the world, SAP in Germany is a great example of that, and they have Qualtrics in the US, et cetera. But there are many companies as well that are publishing corporate sustainability reports because, as Lee pointed out, investors now, called US parlance environmental social governance investors, are an increasingly big group. And there's actually an ETF, an exchange traded fund called Just Capital, which only invests in companies that have a strategic and systematic approach to engaging all stakeholders. And so this whole notion is that this approach to human capital management actually affects stock prices. And to that effect, the Just company actually has an index that is outperforming the Russell 1000 index. So To answer that question, I think the big application for 30414 will be exactly what Lee said earlier. You said earlier, Lee, and that is that companies and investors and employees and customers are going to want to see objective information from companies before they make buying decisions or decisions as to who they want to work for. 70% of Americans in a Just Capital survey that was released last week said that they make buying decisions or decisions about who they want to work for based on their way they treat their people. So Lee, how do we have any objective way to measure and compare all this stuff? Well, this ISO, I believe in Greek means sane, and nothing is perfect, but ISO helped rebuild Europe in the Marshall Plan. They helped transform quality management. It helped transform safety management. I think that same strategic and systematic approach will help companies disclose information that will be better for consumers, employees, and their communities. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. So Bruce, there's another question in the private chat box that's regarding the next step with regards to the certification, more information, and particularly the roadmap. So would you like to throw some light on the implementation plan for the certification? Just for the convenience of everyone, might be the others also have a similar question in their mind.
Well, of course, and we'll send a follow-up to everybody who's interested. The first thing to do is to assess whether this has meaning to you and your organization. Whether this, obviously, if you're inquiring, I assume the answer is yes, but everything has to have an economic benefit. We believe the fundamental issue here is that human capital is an asset and an investment, not a resource and a cost. So it's kind of time to hit the reset button. And if you're not working for an organization or don't believe there's a receptivity to seeing human capital as an asset and an investment and as a tangible, in a sense, asset on the balance sheet, don't waste your time, okay? Secondly, there are two different types of, the answer is yes, and you see an opportunity within your organization or to help them with their corporate responsibility disclosures. And also, as Lee said, to make sure you're tracking the data that really matters to your own management and to that of your customers, right? And to your employees and to the government officials who are regulators, right? So then the next process is involved determining whether you can qualify as either an auditor or as a developer. You can't do both for the same company. An auditor is one who would be looking at an organization's disclosures to see that they are in conformance with ISO guidelines, which, by the way, are developed over many years through a very laborious process that, frankly, I have grown to believe actually leads to better results, as frustrating as it is to we Americans who like to get things done in 3 weeks. But those guidelines, you can either be an auditor or you can be a certifier or a developer. And a developer would somebody who would help the organization benefit from conformance with these standards by understanding them and helping implement them with under always the direction of the CEO. That's another criteria for this. If the CEO is not embracing it, don't waste your time. Really, this is that's a fundamental requirement of ISO. It's a shall in ISO, to my understanding, Lee, that the CEO now, it's called NXSL. It's a provision that applies to all ISO people management standards that the CEO has to be involved in. We're doing an audit next week for another standard, and we're meeting with the CEO and all the executive team individually. So moving on rapidly, I'm sorry, then once you've determined it makes sense, if you have to then determine whether you can actually be an auditor or a certifier, you have to have at least 3 years management experience, of course, a university or college level, at a, obviously baccalaureate at a, or equivalent at a, at a university, a registered university in your country. Then in addition, again, 3 years auditing or management experience is a minimum requirement to get a full provisional certification. Zahid, is this too detailed? I can do it in 1 more minute. Am I okay here?
Yeah, I think it's fine. Please go ahead.
Okay. Those of you who are not interested will drop off, of course. So then moving on, once you've determined if you don't have those 3 years, you can get a certification that prepares you for it. but there is that minimum requirement. And if you haven't gone to college, yes, you can get a certificate that shows that you've demonstrated the knowledge, but you cannot get the ISO certification. It's an IC certification. The ISO certification requires these minimal standards. Then you must buy the standard from ISO. It's usually about, I think, 138 Swiss francs, whatever that is in your respective currencies. And then on top of that, there are 4 mandatory classes. They're webinar classes. They are scheduled each month, starting this January on Wednesdays, and they'll be based on demand. Obviously, the first class is always open to the public. In a sense, you just participated, folks, in your first class. So if any of you who are interested in proceeding, you do not have to attend the first class in January. And the plan is to hold the classes either monthly or quarterly for different time zones. So if you miss a class one month, you can take that class another month. And you really don't, it's best to do it sequentially, but you could probably manage without that, because you will be quizzed after each class. You'll be sent a few questions. You won't today because none of you have enrolled, but to make sure that you've participated. And then at the end of that, after those 4 classes and you've bought the standard and the deck is available to you, we also provide other information. We provide an article that explains all of this and background. When you are ready, you meet with your examiner, and all of you are working through Zahid at this point, so he would be coordinating all of this. And your examiner then explains to your case study. It's a written case study, and you're given, you can do one of 2 things. You can do your own company, and it can be with an NDA or whatever, but a non-disclosure agreement. So that your case study can be the one that we give you, which is a company we've invented with criteria. Or we will give you, you can actually use your organization, and it will take you through everything you would have to do that either audit, and you could either do it as an audit or you would develop their plan. You could do it either one. And if you want to be an auditor, then you would do an audit. And if you want to be a developer, your case study will be based on developing, I should say, that compliant disclosure and strategy. So I'm just about near my completion here. And yes, this is involved to a degree. This is a serious certification. Ron and Lee and Zahid spent 8 years, I believe, developing all of this, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and they will not let it be poisoned by trying to turn a dollar. And so there will be very strict compliance at every level of this thing to ensure that people are capable. The good news is that this particular standard is not rocket science. It truly, it is one of the more easier standards to implement from the others, which really require culture change. ISO 10018 requires culture change. If the company isn't already arrived at an enterprise approach to engaging people, it's got a lot of work to do. Anybody can do a disclosure, and it can be the news may not be good, but the disclosure could be in conformance with best practices or effective practices. So finally, in conclusion, the examination is 2-part. It is this written case study, and then there's a 1 hour, at least, can go into 2 hours, webinar meeting that's recorded with your examiner. And Zahid, I am proud to announce to you folks, and you are all the first to hear, that Zahid has just completed his certification for ISO 30414 and received his certificate today. So Zahid, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And Zahid, it could not go to somebody more worthy of this, because again, what gives IC, and people ask us, what gives IC the authority to provide this certification? Well, it's that its founders are the people that created these standards, and that literally created, with of course, their great colleagues in Great Britain and Germany and France and Italy and Africa and other countries, who created these standards. So it's imperative to my colleagues that these standards be put into practice and that they be respected, like ISO 9001 and other standards. So anyway, so once you've completed your verbal presentation, That gets you a provisional ISO certification, meaning that you've demonstrated to have your own knowledge, you have knowledge, all of the knowledge and understanding to complete such an auditor certification. And unless you can shortcut that if for your examination you use your own company or a client. If you actually use a real client or your own company, then you can go right to an actual certification. And then I won't go into any more details, but all there's a very interesting business model for ways for people to, everything in capitalism, we say, if you can't sell it, then it's not going to happen. And so this is a virtuous circle whereby you folks and people can make money or help their organizations make money by helping other companies make money in a transparent way and in a way that creates a better experience by applying the same strategic and systematic approach that has transformed quality, or frankly, that rebuilt Europe after World War II, which is the root. I think we should all remember that is ISO's roots. But anyway, I've gone on too long. I hope that explains it, Zahid.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for the comprehensive information. So toward the end, is there anybody from the house who want to say something with regards to what has been discussed? Or if not, then I would very briefly like to see comments of the Dr. Christian. I met him for the first time in Azerbaijan. He came from Germany, and later on he sent me an article on the subject. So Dr. Christian, would you like to shed some brief thoughts on what you have heard and how do you feel about it?
Yes, thank you very much for introducing me here. And to all of you, thank you very much for this most valuable information you shared this evening, German time. And I think I dare to speak for all of us as your audience here. What Zahid, you just made reference to is that in my career as an HR practitioner a couple of years ago, I actually put a focus on that, what I think you, Lee, mentioned at the very end of your presentation, and that is how can we shift the focus within a business organization from people as a cost factor to people as an investment. And in line with this, all that what you presented here will very much help reshift the focus from cost to investment. My way, that was back in 2011, 2012, was already quite some time ago, was to introduce the human capital return of investment to have a basis for discussion, especially with the colleagues from the finance organization and the strategic department of the company I was serving, to understand a little bit better how much we get in return for every dollar, for every euro we invest into our people. And what was important was that the investment was not just, so to say, salaries, redundancy cost for hiring, cost for training, but also that what we call perhaps a little bit improperly the opportunity costs that for instance, were estimates, of course, of how much it costs an organization when somebody leaves. So the voluntary leavers